Hey folks, today we're covering Dev Diary 181 and this is going to cover natural disasters that will be with us in All Under Heaven. That is in the next DLC that we're getting. That is going to be Coronations, but the DLC after that, the last major DLC of Chapter 4, we all know this is coming. This is going to be China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and a bunch of other content as well. And natural disasters is just a small part of that. It isn't a major feature really, but it is a feature that is going to impact your gameplay. And at the beginning here, they're going to talk about like why it's coming to the game. Historically, kings weren't always seen as being successful due to their armies, due to how well their marriages went. Sometimes they were judged on how well they reacted to natural disasters, diseases, things like that, and that is why this system has come into the game. Now, I will say, as we go through this Dev Diary, I'm not 100% sure this is Crusader Kings content. Now, it obviously is. It's coming in a Crusader Kings DLC, but I'm not sure, like, philosophically, I suppose, when I play Crusader Kings, do I want to be cleaning up after natural disasters, or do I want to be doing something a little bit more interesting? I'm not too sure. Again, it's not a major feature. As we'll go through this, it actually looks quite interesting how this plays out. There's some cool bonuses. It is going to mix things up. They're going to talk about that. It can disrupt kind of like the flow of things in certain areas, and not just rivers, but actually like the political side of things in some areas. But as I said, I'm not too sure this is like what I want to be doing in Crusader Kings. But anyway, we can discuss that as we go through the Dev Diary. The first thing they're going to show here is a really nice illustration. This is going to appear when these disasters are happening, and you can see it's just showing obviously the devastation that's hit somewhere and how that is going to be affecting your realm. The next part I'm not going to read through. This is just telling you about some historical examples of when this happened. An example in China with the rivers flooding and how that affected one of the dynasties, and the second part about the Holy Roman Empire and how they interacted with an earthquake in 1138 and what kind of spiraled out of that historically. But getting to the content itself, so they've designed this feature. They wanted to be careful to ensure that natural disasters shaked up the political landscape of the region without being too punishing for players. If they got caught up in this system, obviously through no fault of their own, it is a natural disaster. You don't get to choose when these happen. Natural disasters by their very nature are random, and there wasn't much things even the wisest ruler in medieval times could do to stop something like this happening. They didn't understand as much like how floods happened. Obviously earthquakes you can't stop anyway, but talking about in these times, you had no way to know these were going to happen. And then how you dealt with them was more how your realm saw you, if you're a good ruler or not. And to show how this feature is going to work, they're going to show us again, similar to last week, how this will actually play out in games. So we're going to find them here in 1081. We've got the Caliph of the Fatimid Sultanate, and he has just taken over at the age of 34, and he thinks everything's going to go really well. Well, no, a flood is about to hit Egypt, as it did many times historically, and this is going to be about how you can work through this disaster system. So you can see the first thing here, Nile River, high watermark. Now this is in the Nile. They do say later on, if you are located on a river that could flood, you'll get similar events to this. But as you can see, you'll get this event, the Nile River will soon flood, and that is going to start happening relatively soon. So the river expands beyond the floodplains, engulfing everything in its path. We know this is coming, and yet the masses of the realm, by and large, do not know yet. I guess this is kind of leaning towards you would just historically know, look, the river's getting really high, it's probably going to flood soon, because we know about that historically. The local people, probably not so much. They've got other things to be doing. They don't realize the disaster that is steadily heading towards them. And then for the natural disaster system, they're using the situation system once again. This was used in Khan's Step for the weather systems in the 3 parts of the step. And then in this DLC, it's also being used for dynastic cycles and the Silk Road, which they haven't really covered. So I guess that's a future Dev Diary, where they're going to talk through the Silk Road specifically. Similar to those situations, we'll have participating characters, geographic regions, and you can go through the phases of this system. They're going to show that off in some screenshots later on. And each one of these has its own effects and modifiers. And in this example, at this first stage, we're in the warning phase of a disaster where you know it's coming. I guess for like earthquakes, you don't get this section. It just happens immediately. It would be a bit weird if you get like advanced knowledge of an earthquake coming. But I guess for flooding, it does make sense. Again, you can kind of see the river coming up, and you would figure out it's probably going to flood. As the first warning signs appear, we get a choice of waiting to see what happens or immediately devoting ourselves to address this calamity that is coming. If the disaster is also going to affect the court, you also can go into hiding, you can go into isolation, similar to what you can do with diseases. Although this could be costly in terms of public opinion, because obviously they see the ruler kind of hiding in his castle and saying, hey, this is all going to flood, but I'm just going to sit here and watch. they're not going to be too pleased about that. And then the next screenshot, you can see that in effect in the game as it looks currently. This is work in progress. You can see the Nile River, swollen banks, you're getting some stress. You're also being told this is starting. And then if you're going to go directly help, you'll actually get Regency whilst you're dealing with this specifically. Or very similar to when a war breaks out and you're at a tournament, you can just say, I'm going to stick around at the tournament. Somebody else can deal with that war. Obviously, as the player, you are playing that war, but you know, your character is kind of one step removed from directly being involved, and it looks like that is very similar here as well. You can see on the right-hand side, Nile River flood. Flood severity 1 out of 3, so very similar to the disease system. You can see again the art that was there previously. It looks very different here. They've put a color over it. I don't know if that's how it's going to look finally. It looks a little bit strange, but anyway, that is how it looks. You can see the current phase is that warning phase they talked about. You can see the phase effects, obviously nothing really at the moment. And then the affected characters, I guess this is rulers in the path of this disaster. And then below you can see recommendations. What do you want to do? Move your armies and characters out of this area. So I guess, yes, if you have your army sat on a river and that river floods, they're going to get absolutely wrecked by water. You know, don't be doing that. Don't keep them there. This will be really interesting, actually, for warfare. Like, if you're fighting in the Nile and then this flood happens, it could drastically change because we all know the AI is super smart in this game. I wonder if you could trick an army to, like, follow you and then a flood comes in and, like, wrecks half their army. That would actually make this even more interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, but that is actually a cool feature of this. And then it does give other things here, like avoid investing in this area because you might build buildings that get destroyed, and then also save your money. You might want to deal with a great project that they're going to talk about later on, how you can recover from this happening. So again, a kind of redo of the disease system, but with some additional things you could do in this system as well. So soon after this, the disaster reaches its impact phase. People at large now understand the terrible danger they are in. And who do they blame? Well, you, of course, as the ruler. You were sent here by God to rule them, so why are you allowing this to happen? When impact hits, you lose legitimacy. Usually this amount will be bearable if you're a well-established ruler with a good track record and the trust of the people. But if you are newly in charge, like the person in this example, and you haven't built up your legitimacy, you haven't built it up by doing funerals, different ways you can kind of cheese that system a little bit, you will feel this hit to your legitimacy. It can affect you quite badly. And then they say here, note that the legitimacy loss is substantially higher if you are the Emperor of China due to the entanglement of the welfare of the realm and the mandate of heaven. A flood or earthquake in China could be spun as proof of the ruling dynasty's corruption, and if the disaster strikes during a period of instability in the dynastic cycle, its hit is even harder than previous. So this is how this content can affect everywhere in the world. But for China, it has this additional spin to it, which is kind of cool to see. If you play there, it does have these additional, as they said, historical reasons why it hits even harder there. You can see in the next screenshot, Nile River flood, a rush of water. In this example, he lost legitimacy, and then every county in this area that is affected, control will be reduced, and also they will gain a debuff that will happen to them as well. You can see the phase effects on the right-hand side. Those are the effects that we just read there. And then again, how many people are affected, and then again, what you might want to do to recover from this situation. The next screenshot, Nile River flood survivor, the ruler in this example, he lived, well, his brother, not so much. He is in the list of people who died on the left-hand side. Again, kind of similar to how diseases work. You can see that list of people who were killed by disease. This is also going to show here. I guess it's going to show you direct family members, dynasty members, maybe vassals in this list. I doubt it lists absolutely everyone who dies from them because some of these can be pretty bad. And then as they showed earlier, the land as well as the people are affected, and you can see that in the next screenshot. Nile River flooded, weak and brittle. In this example, it damaged the fortifications, fort level -3, garrison size minus 50%. So if you're an opportunist ruler nearby to this, if you saw the river flooding, you saw they were getting these modifications, you could quickly run in, try and defeat them. Those lower fort levels, that could help you if you're a little bit behind in siege equipment. This could potentially allow you to siege things down that you couldn't before, or even just siege them down faster than previously. It is, as they said at the beginning, going to have effects on like the dynastic playout of areas, how different realms are going to do politically, depending on if people do take advantage of this. The next thing they're going to show is one of the other consequences that can happen. In this example, Nile River flooded, exodus, and the modifier for this is extensive exodus, holding taxes minus 70%. Development decline minus 1.2 a month. That is really bad. Like if you had this happen in an extended area of your realm, this would really destroy your progress, at least over the short to medium term. It really could have long-lasting effects on you, depending on how often this happened. They're going to talk about that later on. like how often you will see these disasters. They are going to be very rare, they say, just like conquerors are in the game. But they are showing here they can have different effects on your realm, and this one is particularly bad. You could be in a bad situation, then this disaster happens, and you just have zero money. Really will affect how you play out. Maybe you'll pack up your bags, become an adventurer, and leave somebody else to deal with it. That might be what happens in some campaigns. And then after this phase, the worst is over. You will now enter the recovery phase, where you could try rebuild what was lost and restore the people's faith in your rule. But even this phase is not harmless. For every month that this area remains in disrepair, we will lose even more legitimacy. So this, I guess, is kind of tying into legitimacy quite a lot. Now, again, this doesn't happen super often, but this would actually make legitimacy a little bit more interesting as well. Most of the time you can increase that quite easily, but if you had this affecting you, it looks like the modifiers are pretty bad. You can see that in the screenshot. This is affecting it by 0.25 whilst you're in this recovery phase. Until you get rid of this, you're constantly going to be hit by that. If you're playing in an area that has a lot of these disasters, maybe you are playing in the Nile, maybe you'll lean into modifiers that affect your legitimacy, help you bring this back that little bit quicker, and then outside of that, you're going to try get rid of this as soon as you can. Try repair this area, and then the people will forgive you, and you'll go back to having a good old time. It is not all doom and gloom though. Once the great project is completed in trying to repair this area, not only will it remove all the negative modifiers, but it would also give you some bonuses depending on what you did. In addition, for floods specifically, the affected provinces gain bonuses from the additional silt and moisture left behind. So obviously floodplains after the disaster are very fertile historically, and that is going to be shown in the game as well. And they're going to show that in the next screenshot here. So Nile River flood relief, flood fertility, supply limit plus 25%, development growth plus 15%. So this could potentially move past where your development was previously, depending on how long this recovery phase lasts for you. And then below that, you can see these contributions. These were talked about in one of those earlier China dev diaries. You can see the mandatory contributions. As it says, those are mandatory. To finish this phase, you have to pay for all of those. And then the optional contributions, these are things you can do additionally. If you've got some money laying around, if you're a vassal, if you want to pick up some additional bonuses maybe, you can pay for these optional ones and they will give you additional bonuses depending on how much they are and what they are doing. So that is cool to see here. You can see in this example how much it's going to cost. As I said at the beginning, a bit of a gold sink, a lot of money here. Now, this is just one example. It is going to get balanced in the future, but these are very expensive. Look how much they cost. Now, the optional ones, they're obviously optional, so it doesn't matter if they're super expensive. But even finishing the top 3 ones, if you had to do them yourself as a ruler, that's nearly 1,000 gold. As we have said, other people can do this. You can go to your vassal and say, hey, why don't you help me with this? And then they will pay some of it, or they might pay for some of it anyway, but they are the ones you have to do to get out of this phase. So the cost of each component, as we just went through, can be sizable depending primarily on the number of counties affected, their development, and the severity of the disaster. No 2 disasters will play out the same in this regard due to the cost and what you have to do. So you can't really use one example for the next time it happens. Maybe your realm is bigger, maybe it's more developed, maybe the disaster is worse, so it will cost you substantially more than it would have done maybe the first time you encountered this system. So one of the examples we saw in that screenshot was land drainage. This will tie up your army for 10 years, but this will give you a permanent plus 10 direct vassal boost as soon as you fund it. So that is pretty good. It does say permanent. Now, does that mean permanent until they die? Or does it literally mean permanently that will happen? So this is you sending your army to help somewhere. They will help with the drainage, and then they'll come back to you after that time. I guess that means like you can't raise them for an army. It doesn't actually say. It would be actually pretty interesting if you did that, and then you could do this, and then somebody attacks you, and maybe like your levies can't be raised. I know most of you will say levies are useless, but it would be quite impactful if that is how it actually played out. I imagine it just reduces your replenishment, something along those lines. The primary rewards for land drainage are legitimacy and learning experience, which aren't gained until the whole project is completed. However, the survivor recovery option that we saw also in that UI will give you popular opinion boosts upon taking it, but also a tax burden to carry throughout this project until it is completed. So again, you won't be necessarily picking all these options yourself. Your vassals can pay for these out their own goodwill, or if you force them to. They're going to talk about that later on. But if you do pick these up, they do different things depending on which ones you do want to select. So as I said, the drainage one will give you legitimacy and learning. Maybe you're not interested in those, so you want to pay some money, get some popular opinion boosts. Maybe that will help you with your realm, especially if you're early on in your reign. Or maybe you've got a bunch of money and you just pay for all of them. Get all those bonuses as well as you have the money to pay for them. And then as we discussed earlier, there are those optional contributions, and they're not necessary to complete the project, hence the name. But if you can afford them, they do give you some great rewards. Again, they are optional, so the rewards are better than the other options, but as we saw, they are substantially more expensive as well. Resettling refugees requires you to give up some land until the project is complete. This reduces your domain limit for characters of most cultures, but this will yield you twice the legitimacy and a levy reinforcement boost as well, compared to the other ones that we talked about. All these rewards and costs are scaled by innovations. Elephants make it easier to remove debris, for example. Oh, that's actually pretty cool. Having elephants makes this easier. It does make sense, but not something I would have thought about. But of course, as time passes, so does development, and recovering from late-game natural disasters can be much more expensive, especially if you haven't kept up with your technological progress. I guess that's a little bit harsh on tribal realms, because usually you are a little bit behind other realms once you convert to feudalism. It does make sense. Obviously, if you're more progressed as a nation, you'd have better ways to deal with some of these things, but it is kind of harsh on lower tech realms that they are affected even worse than everyone else. Again, it kind of makes sense. Let me know what you think about it in the comments down below. China starts with many relevant innovations to help control disasters, even in 1066, while others will need time to catch up. So I wonder if there's some specific new ones that are coming that directly affect these, or whether it's, as they said, if you have elephants, you will get a bonus towards this. Kind of like when diseases came in, and some older innovations just got bonuses towards disease resistance and other things like that. I guess they're just adding this to some innovations to make it a little bit better. I guess like battlements and things like that might help you in this regard as well. In the next screenshot, you can see that land drainage example they talked about. So you will gain a levy shortage for 10 years. You'll gain a buff effective disease cleanup coordinator, and then you'll gain legitimacy and some learning lifestyle experience, as they mentioned, and then you'll pay for this, and those will take effect for 10 years, and quite a nice bonus here, I suppose. It does cost 300 gold, which isn't a lot. It depends, though, obviously, what you're doing in your realm. Maybe you've got other things going on. Maybe you've got a bunch of wars happening, some bad combinations of things. Maybe you can't afford this, and then the recovery phase just keeps going, and then that will affect your legitimacy the longer it goes on. So you're going to want to try get this finished as soon as possible. Maybe you're going to go to the Pope and say, hey Pope, give me that money. I usually spend that on warfare, but I've got this flood and I need to repair it up as quick as I can, and give me that money please. And he'll say, yes, thank you very much, I'll give you that money, do spend it wisely. And you'll just nod along and go, yeah, sure, I'm definitely going to do that. And then leaning on from that, what happens if you can't pay for it all yourself, or if you don't want to pay it all yourself? The Natural Disaster Recovery Project screen will give you an insight into who would be eligible to pay for this, or who would be able to even. And it will also give you ways to try convince them to pay it for you, maybe through nice means, maybe through not so nice means. In this example, land drainage again. 2 people, as you can see, would be able to help you. You then click on that. You can see on the left-hand side, very similar to inviting people into schemes and things like that. Can be convinced. You'd be able to go into there, maybe give them some prestige, maybe a bribe, which would be weird. Here's some money to do this thing where I need you to give me money. But I guess that is how it could play out. And then the bottom person just refuses. There's not really any way in the short term to get them to actually help you. But maybe you could butter them up. Maybe you could send them somebody from your dynasty or something, get them to like you a little bit more, and then maybe be able to bribe them to get them to the point where they will actually help you. So in this example, as you can see, in exchange for a strong hook, they were able to force this person, they were able to force one of their vassals to do the land drainage contribution, which is a good one. As they point out here, this will reduce their levy reinforcement rate by 75%. Oh, actually, so that explains what it does. It doesn't actually get rid of your levy. It reduces your reinforcement rate by 75% for 10 years. So this could be very good. If you think they're going to rise up against you, if you had a hook on them, you could force them to do this, and then they would have their army. Yes, it only affects levies, but it would potentially make them easier to defeat in a war because they wouldn't be able to replenish their army as quick. Again, it only affects their levies, so it's not like a massive thing. I guess early on it's better, and then as the game progresses, levies get less important, so it's kind of less of a bad modifier, but we'll see how it plays out in game. And again, as you can see in this example, you could try use a hook to do this. So it looks like only hooks can be used to drag them into these things. And then as you progress, completing those 3 required ones, teamwork makes the dream work. Perhaps in a couple of years, you've been able to get together enough money yourself or enough vassals, and you've been able to actually get these completed. You can see in this example, Nile Flood Relief, they've got 2 of the stamps here out of the 3. So this is showing 2 of the 3 mandatory ones are completed. And to finish the last one, you need 376 gold. So again, maybe you save up that money yourself. Maybe you badger somebody else to do it for you. Maybe you get some gold off your Pope or whatever, and then use that to spend this. And then that gets rid of all the negative modifiers. And then you can start picking up those good modifiers And then the last bit of the dev diary is going to be how you see these on map, how often they occur, and how they play out differently in different areas of the map. So to begin with, how will we see these on the map of the game? So the first way is a map pin on the map itself. This will show you the disaster epicenter, so for earthquakes, the center of it. I guess for floods, the beginning bit of the flood, and then it will flow out from that map pin. At quite generous zoom levels, you'll be able to see these quite easily on the map, and then you'll be able to click on them. This will then open the situation panel. Again, very similar to how diseases will show on the map, and it will also display which countries are affected within your border. So again, very similar to diseases or legends. You'll get this overlay where it will show you where it is active. And then very similar to how diseases work, you'll also get terrain shaders. So where diseases are in game, you get that like grayed out look that makes it look very bad. It makes it very apparent where diseases are. It looks like we're getting a version of that. So I guess for flooding, it might be like a blue effect to it. For earthquakes, I'm not sure how this will look. Maybe a brown effect or something along those lines. They do say, unfortunately, they're not going to show us this. I'm not sure why. They do say they're putting the final touches on the new map graphics, which we covered last week in a video. If you missed that news, I covered it in a video last week. They're updating how mountains look, how a lot of the terrain looks in game, making the whole game look that little bit better when this DLC does come out. It is a shame they didn't show us how this works, but they do say, hey, you'll see them in game when you play it. So I guess we'll have to wait to that point. And the natural disasters do not care about realm borders. A flood will affect all countries adjacent to the river, and an earthquake will span many counties in multiple realms. Where a single disaster overlaps many realms, a recovery project will be constructed in each of these realms. You only pay for the provinces in your realm, but it will also be only these provinces that reap the benefits of your contributions. The disaster panel will disappear once the final recovery project has been completed across all the realms that are part of this. So this is interesting. I guess if you have a river that floods and say there's 3 kingdoms along that river, the middle one could recover fully and get some nice bonuses. And then maybe the end of the river and the start of the river, those 2 realms are a bit slower in recovering. So I guess as the middle realm, you could then use that to your advantage and attack the ones next to you. This disaster doesn't just finish when one of you complete your project. Your project is about your realm, not the disaster as a whole. So that's kind of interesting to see how that plays out. It does make sense. I wonder if there was a way, if you were friendly, maybe if you were allied together, where you could combine the projects. That would be pretty interesting. I guess it's probably an additional complexity they don't want to bring into the system. And then the last thing they're going to talk about is how often these happen and about China specifically. So natural disasters are a rare occurrence, just like Conquerors. You might play an entire campaign and not be affected at all across your entire gameplay, but obviously other campaigns, you could have 2 or 3 of them. It's just how the dice roll towards it. To some degree, this also depends on the terrain in your realm and which part of the world you are playing in. Regions that historically suffered earthquakes or floods will have that higher probability in the game. When a region is affected, it is more likely to be centered on terrain suitable for that disaster. Mountainous regions are more prone to earthquakes, and obviously rivers more prone to flooding. You can't get flooding in a desert. Yes, I know there are some examples of that happening, but you know what I mean. It is going to make sense how these play out in game. However, as you can imagine, the larger your realm, the more chance there is that you will get hit by a disaster at any given time. For a realm the size of China, the likelihood of doing so is very high because of how big it is. All the floodplains they have, all the mountains, there's just a chance you're going to have this in every one of your campaigns, maybe even multiples of these. Thankfully, the Emperor has access to 2 tools to deal with this that most of the rulers do not, and that is the Imperial Treasury, which can be used in place of gold to pay for these great projects, and a great many governors with fat salaries will also be able to put their money towards this. Obviously, if they've got other plans, maybe they're using that money to pay for armies to do something bad, they're not going to do this, but they're saying here the realm's so big, you have the Imperial Treasury, which other realms don't have, so maybe you will keep that stocked up, and then one of these disasters happen, and then you can spend that money, get all the nice bonuses yourself, or also you do have all these governors. Some of them will help you in this. Obviously, they're going to get bonuses out of that, but it also means you as the Emperor aren't paying for everything. And then as they mentioned previously, with the increased impact on legitimacy, due to the unceasing turning of the dynastic cycle, and people's perception on how disasters were assigned from the heavens, that change is needed, natural disasters could break or make your Chinese dynasty. So yes, they do affect these more, as we saw earlier, and it could either make something bad happen, or if you're trying to take over the mandate of heaven, you could use it to your advantage. Turn around and say the Emperor is not favored, maybe I should be in charge, and then see how that plays out for you as well. So with that, guys, that is the end of the dev diary this week around natural disasters. The system itself looks quite interesting. It is a gold sink, which is good, especially late game, where you generally have a lot of gold. But there are also a lot of other things you want to be spending that gold on. Obviously building up your cities, building up your buildings, improving them, scaling them up. But then obviously things like activities get ludicrously more expensive as you progress through this game. So there are a lot of these gold sinks. If you could turn these off, guys, would you do that? Let me know in the comments down below. I think these could be interesting. Now, how often they happen, they do say they're rare, but they also said that about Conquerors. And as we know, Conquerors are far from being very rare. So again, how often these happen, how hard it is to pay them off, how often the AI actually helps you with these without needing hooks and things like that is going to sway my thoughts, I think, on how this plays out once you're actually playing it. And then as I also said, philosophically, I guess, do you want to be doing this in Crusader Kings? Is it the kind of content you want? Again, only a small part of this DLC. It's not a massive feature, but it is quite impactful depending on how it plays out. Do you want this kind of stuff in the game? Or would you rather they added some more military things or more adventures you could go on and not just something that is ultimately a gold sink to get some bonuses or to negate bad bonuses? Anyway, let me know what you think, but with that, we'll leave it there for today. So hit that like button if you've enjoyed today's video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm covering all the news around Crusader Kings, and I'm also covering EU5 as well on the channel. So if you're interested in either of those games, subscribe, and there'll be plenty of videos coming in the future. But we'll leave it there for today, and I'll see you all next time.